60 BC, Ptolemy Auletes visited Rome to procure senatorial sanction for his rule of Egypt, and drained his kingdom's entire year's revenue paying bribes to both Caesar and Pompeius Magnus. In order to pay Caesar and Pompeius at least some portion of the bribes, Ptolemy Auletes, having the wisdom not to travel from Egypt bearing cash, would have secured loans from many of Rome's creditors. Using these creditors, Ptolemy likely paid half of what he owed to Pompeius and Caesar, with promises of paying the remainder upon his return to Egypt. However, upon returning to Egypt, Ptolemy Auletes was cast out by his daughter, Berenike, and forced to return to Rome as an exile in 57 BC. Those same creditors, knowing they'd never see repayment from Ptolemy Auletes, unless he held on to his throne, opportunistically gave their senatorial support for Rome's military intervention in Egypt. Pompeius, who did not want to look too eager for another military command, found himself in competition with Crassus for the command. In the end, Crassus, unable to sway the Senate into granting him command of the army, used priests who owed their positions to him, to locate and translate an obscure passage in the Sibylline books as a warning against Rome's military involvement in Egypt. This warning, the Senate took to heart. With military assistance off the table, Ptolemy was secretly advised by Pompeius to seek out the proconsul of Syria, Aulus Gabinius. Ptolemy did as he was told, and offered Gabinius 10,000 talents to help him. Hoping to prevent Marcus Licinius Crassus from gaining control of Egypt, Pompeius ignored the Senate's order to withhold military aid, and privately ordered Aulus Gabinius to assist the exiled king, before Crassus arrived in the province to relieve him of his Syrian proconsulship. Still serving as Gabinius's cavalry commander, Marcus Antonius thus found himself in Egypt during the early part of the 55 BC year. Having done his part in thwarting Alexander of Judea's attempt to overthrow his uncle Hyrcanus as high priest, Antonius was itching for more military action, and persuaded Aulus Gabinius to follow Pompeius's illegal command, and defy the Senate. Unfortunately for Antonius, when Gabinius's legions arrived in Alexandria, Queen Berenike's guards dropped their weapons, and surrendered without a fight. For usurping his throne, Ptolemy Auletes executed his eldest daughter, along with all her supporters. Now securely in control of Egypt once again, King Ptolemy's accounts needed to be settled. One of his creditors, a senator in the pay of Pompeius, named Gaius Rabirius Posthumus, marched into Egypt alongside Aulus Gabinius and Marcus Antonius. With Ptolemy Auletes firmly on his throne, Rabirius Posthumus immediately called in his loan from the king. But Ptolemy Auletes, having only just returned to Egypt, was unprepared to reimburse his financier, which would involve the time to raise and collect taxes. The last time the king had drastically increased taxes, he had been exiled from his country by an angry mob who supported, instead, the reign of his daughter. And even though Aulus Gabinius had agreed to leave the king 2,000 Roman troops and mercenaries called the Gabiniani, to help him maintain control, 2,000 would never suffice should the entire city of Alexandria rise up against him. Not knowing what to do, Ptolemy Auletes turned again to Aulus Gabinius. So that Pompeius might gain direct access to Egypt's finances, Aulus Gabinius advised Ptolemy Auletes to make Gaius Rabirius Posthumus the official minister of finance. Let Rabirius, who was a successful banker, administrate the raising of the necessary funds. Ptolemy Auletes, knowing any blame for the tax increase would be shifted from himself to Gaius Rabirius Posthumus, quickly agreed, and Rabirius Posthumus was named Egypt's minister of finance. Unfortunately, while Aulus Gabinius was in Egypt, the same Alexander of Judea, who had been defeated by Gabinius, but afterward released, raised more legions, and once again, pushed towards Jerusalem to depose his uncle, Hyrcanus, as Judea's high priest. And so, from Egypt, Marcus Antonius marched with Aulus Gabinius straight into Judea. At Mount Tabor, in Lower Galilee, Alexander of Judea was, again, defeated by Aulus Gabinius, along with 10,000 of his men. And though Alexander managed to escape, the battle offered Marcus Antonius yet another chance to put his fighting and cavalry abilities into action. By the beginning of 54 BC, and with the arrival of Syria's new proconsul, Marcus Licinius Crassus, Aulus Gabinius had restored order. Crassus, however, was infuriated to learn that Ptolemy Auletes was already reinstalled on his Egyptian throne by the time he arrived. Crassus had planned to use one of his own legates to help Ptolemy, thereby gaining authority over Egypt's king. As Aulus Gabinius and Marcus Antonius left the province, they were harassed and even attacked along the way, likely by secret supporters of Crassus. Once they reached Rome, it was not long before Aulus Gabinius was charged with perduellio, or high treason. Regardless of the Senate's decree regarding Egypt, the moment Aulus Gabinius left his province without senatorial consent, he was guilty of high treason. Before long, Crassus' supporters within the Senate put together a team of prosecuting advocates. The fact that Cato served as president of the Treason Court for the 54 BC year was a good indication that the prosecution expected an easy victory. But Pompeius Magnus, who had not taken up residence in his province of Hispania, had other ideas. Following the opening of his theatre, and its accompanying festival, Pompeius's popularity, which had declined after the 55 BC elections were stolen, was once again on the rise. And even though he took heavy criticism from the crowd over the cruelty of elephant fights that were a part of his festival, with ongoing gang wars between Clodius and Milo, and an uncertain political atmosphere, Pompeius Magnus was now the most powerful man in Rome, the one to whom the people turned in the face of so much chaos, whispering the word dictator. Among the prosecution against Aulus Gabinius was Pompeius's nephew, Gaius Memmius. Memmius was the son of Pompeius's sister, and also the man who married Pompeius's discarded third wife, Mucia Tertia. But, regardless of how many prosecuting advocates Crassus' supporters produced, without Rome's top orator, Marcus Tullius Cicero, they had little chance of winning against Pompeius's senatorial support. And so, making it known that he did not wish his man, Aulus Gabinius, found guilty, Pompeius bribed, threatened, and called in favors. From Cicero, who owed Pompeius his very return from exile, he extracted promises of not joining the team of prosecuting advocates gathered by Crassus' supporters. Cicero hated Aulus Gabinius. During his year as consul, Gabinius refused to protect Cicero from the attacks of Publius Clodius, which led to Cicero's exile. In addition to colluding with Clodius at Cicero's downfall, Gabinius, after Clodius convinced the Senate to confiscate his property, had taken for himself the villa Cicero had built as a country retreat in Tusculum. And finally, given an opportunity to avenge himself against Aulus Gabinius, Cicero, by the order of Pompeius Magnus, could not join the prosecution. He had to satisfy himself, instead, with venting his frustration through slanderous jabs written to his brother, Quintus Cicero, who was serving under Caesar in Gaul. Despite the Senate's effort to convict, Aulus Gabinius was acquitted of high treason. However, when Gaius Rabirius Posthumus, who learned firsthand how the Alexandrians react to overtaxation, arrived in Rome, the Senate found an opportunity to lay different charges against Gabinius. Rabirius Posthumus, in attempting to reclaim his loans, had so taxed the Alexandrians that they, again, rioted. Ptolemy Auletes was forced to place Rabirius Posthumus in a prison cell for his own protection, until he could arrange his safe passage from Egypt. When Rabirius Posthumus turned up in Rome, a few months after Gabinius's trial for high treason, a new charge of repetundus, or extortion, was brought against him. Gabinius had accepted 10,000 talents from Ptolemy Auletes before marching his legions into Alexandria. Again, Pompeius turned to Cicero. This time, however, he did not merely ask the orator to refrain from prosecution, but insisted Cicero defend Gabinius. Given little choice, Cicero did as he was told, but, likely due to Cicero's lack of enthusiasm, Aulus Gabinius was found guilty, and exiled from Rome. While in the city, during the trials of his commanding officer, Marcus Antonius married his first cousin, Antonia, the daughter of Marcus Antonius Hybrida, who had shared Cicero's consulship, and who had been prosecuted for his crimes against the people of Macedonia. With Antonia Hybrida, Marcus Antonius became the father of a daughter, also named Antonia. Now with a family to support, and his commander exiled from Rome, Marcus Antonius needed a new posting. and the place to be by the autumn of 54 BC, was Gaul, under the command of Julius Caesar. Not only had he led his army across the Rhine River the previous summer, but he was the first general to launch an invasion of Britannia. Although Marcus Antonius' mother was Caesar's third cousin, the relationship was too distant for advantage. Instead, Antonius turned to his old friend, Publius Clodius, with whom he and his brothers had run the streets, and convinced Clodius to recommend his services to Caesar. By the autumn of 54 BC, Marcus Antonius was on his way to join Caesar's powerhouse in Gaul.